In the imposing Connecticut mansion, the silence seemed to scream between walls covered in gold and secrets. He, a millionaire surrounded by power, lived in a marriage that, in the eyes of society, was perfect, but internally corroded by coldness and distrust. And it was in this environment of luxury and solitude that his eyes, previously accustomed to contracts and figures, lost themselves in the simplicity of someone who should never have occupied a place in his heart. The maid who served coffee silently, with a dignity that wounded his wife's pride. What began as an innocent glance soon turned into an invisible war, a minefield of emotions, where every gesture concealed desire, every word carried risk. Forbidden passion was about to ignite, and with it inevitable tragedy. The wife noticed all too quickly the subtle change in her husband's eyes, and, like a silent beast, she decided not to lose her position to someone she considered inferior. What no one knew was that this struggle for space within the most luxurious house in town would be just the beginning of a devastating downfall. Blackmail, humiliation, and accusations would emerge like slowly distilled poison, transforming the mansion into a war zone. But fate, always silent and cruel, held a secret that none of them could have imagined, a secret capable of destroying reputations, reversing roles, and revealing who was truly faithful and who merely wore masks to hide even deeper betrayals. If this story has you hooked so far, leave a like and subscribe for more intense stories like this. The Connecticut dawn broke golden over the mansion that seemed untouched by time, a fortress of marble and glass erected as a monument to the success of a man who had achieved everything he desired, or almost everything. Outside, the gardens were meticulously manicured, fountains gushed silently, and imported cars gleamed in the cool breeze. But behind this architectural perfection lay a void that could not be filled with either luxury or the weight of the surname the entire town revered. The millionaire gazed from the balcony at the orange-tinged horizon, but his gaze was distant, as if searching for something that wasn't there. Beside him, in another room of the same house, his wife prepared herself before ornate mirrors with gilded frames, draped in expensive silk, scented with essences from France. She knew the power she wielded and wore it like an invisible crown, but her expression was cold, calculated, as if every smile she offered were part of a game that was no longer fun. Between them lay a silent abyss, a coexistence marked by appearances, gala dinners, and social engagements that merely maintained the illusion of a perfect marriage. The truth, however, was that the two no longer saw, touched, or sought each other out. The house, filled as it was with the voices of servants, guests, and distant family members, had become a space of shared solitude. It was in this atmosphere of sterile wealth that an unexpected, discreet, and nearly invisible figure emerged. The new maid had arrived weeks earlier, from a humble neighborhood in the city, her eyes bearing the serenity of someone familiar with life's hardships, and her gestures a humility that contrasted with the ostentation of the place. Her uniform was impeccable, but it was in the way she walked, always with her head held high and her steps silent, that something different resided. She didn't seem to bow to the weight of the luxurious surroundings, yet she respected every detail, every rule, as if she knew the value of the opportunity at hand. The millionaire first noticed her by chance as she was serving coffee in the grand living room. It wasn't the coffee that captivated him, nor the perfection of her serving, but rather the way she averted her gaze to avoid meeting his eyes. There was a rare dignity in that simplicity, something that contrasted sharply with the practiced smiles he was accustomed to. Receiving. His wife also noticed the maid's presence, but not with the same eyes. To her, this young woman represented just another piece on the board, someone destined to obey and disappear without a trace. She didn't yet know, however, that it would be this very silent figure who would shake the foundations of her security. In the heart of the mansion, the routine seemed the same as always. Flowers changed daily, lavish tables prepared by invisible hands, visitors from influential people, circulating the corridors as if it were a palace. But there was a new energy hovering in the air, almost imperceptible, a thread of tension connecting three destinies destined to collide. The millionaire still didn't understand why his attention was drawn to such small details. A shy smile, a delicate gesture, a look that lingered half a second too long, but he already sensed something was changing. And this shift, as subtle as it was dangerous, was about to transform the silence into a storm. In that house of marble and silence, where every gesture was calculated and every word seemed to weigh tons, the millionaire's gaze began to wander over details that had previously gone unnoticed. It wasn't something planned nor admitted, but each morning when she appeared with the coffee tray, there was a moment when time seemed to slow down. He noticed the way the maid held the china firmly, betraying no sign of nervousness, and how her eyes searched the floor instead of looking directly at her. Boss. It was a silent respect, but within him a strange feeling arose that averted gaze hid something deeper. Perhaps fear, perhaps shame, or perhaps a strength she herself didn't know she possessed. The millionaire, accustomed to flattery and smiles that always hid ulterior motives, found her simplicity strange. No one had ever treated him with such discretion. Everyone who approached seemed to have a hidden list of requests, interests, or ambitions. But not with her. She served, fulfilled her duties, and withdrew silently without seeking approval, without trying to show off. This absence of vanity was what held him captive, like a silent magnet capable of disarming his armor of coldness. The days passed, and his gaze began to linger too long. It was an imperceptible slip to the naked eye, but within the mansion nothing escaped. His wife, attentive to every detail, soon noticed the change. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. When her husband answered a question, his eyes lingered half a second longer than necessary to stray from the young maid's presence. When she entered the room, there was a brief pause in the air, as if her mere entry altered the rhythm of the conversation. His wife's heart, hardened by pride, recognized the danger even before the words were spoken. In the kitchen, the atmosphere was different. Amid the pots and pans and the aromas of spices, the maid hid her growing unease. She knew she was being watched, but she didn't understand why. She felt the weight of the gazes, sometimes discreet, sometimes too long, and it left her conflicted. She shouldn't, allow her mind to wander. She was there to work, to support her distant family, not to lose herself in impossible dreams. And yet there was something in her boss's silence that awakened feelings she tried to suppress. The millionaire began finding excuses to show up wherever she was. A walk in the garden when he knew she was watering the plants, an unexpected visit to the kitchen under the pretense of complimenting the dinner, a quick comment about the weather, only to hear her simple reply. These were banal interactions, but each one fueled a hidden, dangerous, and forbidden fire. The wife, increasingly attentive, began to observe not only her husband but also the maid. Her eyes were sharp as razors, ready to detect any slip-up. The smile she offered in public, perfect and rehearsed, hid a volcano about to erupt. Within her, a conviction grew. This young woman must be controlled, silenced, or eliminated from the house before it was too late. What none of them knew was that these silent glances were paving the way for an inevitable war, where every gesture would be interpreted as a threat, and every silence would carry the weight of an unspeakable secret. Desire grew, hidden beneath layers of routine, ready to explode the moment the first flame was lit. The millionaire's wife always had a keen instinct, shaped by years of living. In a world where appearances were everything, and threats rarely came face to face. Her life was made up of social games, fragile alliances, and silent disputes at luxurious cocktail parties, and so she learned to recognize dangers before they even became visible. Thus, it wasn't difficult to notice the subtle change in her husband's behavior. It was something that would have escaped any other woman, but not her. His gaze lingered too long on the maid, and even though it was a minor detail, for his wife it was already a warning sign. The first time he noticed, he feigned indifference. He preferred to believe it was a figment of his imagination, a whim of his ever-suspicious mind. But the days passed, and his suspicions solidified into certainty. Her husband, so accustomed to avoiding distractions, seemed to find in the maid's silence a respite he found nowhere else. There was something in her restrained gestures that captured his attention dangerously, and his wife felt her control slowly slipping through her fingers. Determined to confirm her intuition, she began observing every interaction. From the hallways to the meals, nothing escaped her. When the young woman entered with breakfast, she noticed the slight stiffness in her husband's body. When the waitress cleared the plates, she saw a restrained, almost imperceptible gleam in his eyes, but for her it was like a silent confession. Her wife's heart knew no innocence. She knew that even without words, there was a connection growing in that forbidden space. Wounded pride began to turn to poison. She would not be humiliated in her own home, much less replaced by someone she considered insignificant. The maid, in her view, was nothing more than an intruder who dared to take up too much space. Even silently, even without seeking anything, her mere presence was an affront. His wife began creating situations to test, small traps disguised as normality. She would ask the waitress to serve the wine at dinner, just to observe her husband, or send her to tidy the office, imagining she would find grounds to accuse her. Every gesture was an attempt to catch a slip-up, but what irritated her most was that there was nothing concrete. The young woman remained firm, discreet, untouchable. This silent dignity only increased her wife's fury, because it made the contrast between her arrogance and the other's serenity even more evident. The millionaire, for his part, sensed the tension, but chose to remain silent. He didn't want to confront his wife, but he also couldn't ignore the growing feeling that drew him to that simple figure. It was a dilemma that gnawed at him, and his hesitation only fueled the anger of someone who already felt threatened. The mansion, once the setting for glamorous events, was beginning to transform into a stage for a cold war. Polite smiles hid veiled insults, and every meal became an invisible battlefield where looks spoke louder than words. The wife, firm in her conviction, decided she wouldn't wait for things to resolve themselves. If an intruder was threatening her place, she would put an end to it herself before the forbidden flame turned into a blaze. The first humiliations came disguised as jokes, small barbs thrown with the subtlety of someone who masters the art of wounding without ever losing their smile. The millionaire's wife chose her moments precisely, always in front of her husband, as if each word was intended to remind the maid of her place. "You must be tired, aren't you? That uniform looks so heavy. I can only imagine how difficult it must be to carry so much cloth every day." Her tone was light, almost sweet, but her gaze was sharp as a blade. The young woman swallowed her discomfort in silence, responding only with a respectful nod, her voice never wavering. At mealtimes, the wife made a point of asking the maid to perform unnecessary tasks, such as fetching an extra set of silverware or replacing a perfectly clean glass, just to prolong her exposure. Each order was a way of reaffirming her superiority over her husband, as if to say without words, "She's here to serve, nothing more." The millionaire watched in silence, uncomfortable, but didn't dare confront his wife directly. Tension hung in the air, and the young woman's every gesture became all the more dignified for enduring the hostility without breaking. The cruelest moment came during a dinner attended by influential friends. His wife, with an impeccable smile, asked the waitress to serve the wine, but made a point of commenting loudly, "Be careful not to spill it on the Italian linen tablecloth. It would be a shame to ruin something so expensive with such inexperienced hands." The guests chuckled quietly, some out of convenience, others out of discomfort, and the millionaire felt his blood boil. But again, he restrained himself. He didn't want to expose the marriage, he didn't want to make a show of it. The young woman, however, maintained her composure, poured each glass without spilling a drop, and left the room with her head held high. It was at that moment that the millionaire realized the difference. While his wife was basking in humiliation, the maid was strengthening herself in silence. The provocations didn't stop there. Some mornings the wife would deliberately change the schedule, demanding that the maid redo tasks already completed. She'd have silverware that shone like mirrors polished or flowers already. Perfectly arranged. It was an invisible war, a constant attempt to wear down the one she saw as an enemy. But instead of weakening, the young woman found unexpected strength. Each repeated task, became an exercise in patience, each bitter word proof that she wouldn't be brought down by someone else's pride. The millionaire, increasingly torn, began to clearly see the difference between the two women. On one side, the wife who used her power to humiliate. On the other, the maid who transformed every insult into silent resistance. This comparison, though never spoken aloud, began to erode the perfect image he had of his marriage. There was something grandiose in the young woman's simplicity, something that contrasted with his wife's pompous emptiness, and the more the wife tried to belittle the maid, the more she involuntarily elevated her in her husband's eyes. The humiliations, which should have served as a reminder of her position, ended up becoming living proof of the dignity that endured without needing words. The power play was just beginning, but it was already clear that the wife had chosen a dangerous weapon. The more she struck, the more she strengthened the enemy she believed she could destroy. That week, the mansion seemed to breathe a different air, as if the walls sensed something the residents insisted on denying. It was on a rainy afternoon that the first spark escaped the realm of thoughts to touch the visible world, when a storm knocked out the power for a few minutes, and the millionaire went down to the kitchen to check on everyone. He found the maid collecting candles on a silver tray, her face illuminated by a warm glow that made her eyes seem deeper than any room in the house. In the brief moment, the candle flickered between them. There was a delicate silence that didn't seem like a lack of words, but an excess of meaning. He asked her if she was afraid of the dark, and she replied that the dark only scares us when we forget where the light is. He smiled in a way he hadn't smiled in years, feeling a relief that came not from the generator working again, but from the presence of someone who demanded nothing but respect. Then he offered her his coat, because the rain had chilled the air, and his hand brushed hers by chance. A brief touch, almost nothing, but enough for them both to recognize each other in something they hadn't yet dared admit. The next day the routine seemed the same, but every repetition now carried a new vibration, as if each gesture were a note in a secret concerto. When she watered the hydrangeas in the garden, he appeared with a comment about the weather. When she organized the books in the office, he appeared to thank her for a detail only someone thoughtful would notice. And when she passed through the hallway with the tea tray, he opened the door just as the scent of lemon and honey intersected with the memory of his childhood, and the gratitude in him had the texture of something very old, suddenly rediscovered. That evening, during a smaller dinner, his wife mentioned a charity event and asked the waitress to write down the number of guests, but the pen didn't work. Without thinking, he took another from his pocket and placed it in her palm, and the residual heat of the metal between skin and skin spun the room for a second, while the silverware and crystal continued their indifferent ballet. No one noticed, except his wife, who stored that micro-gesture as if gathering evidence for a future verdict. Still, the forbidden flame was born not of defiance or revenge, but of delicacy. One morning the maid saw the millionaire standing before an old painting of his father, a rigid man painted in harsh colors, and she asked if he missed being just a son at some point in the day. The question, so simple, opened a window in him that the entire city had never known where it was, and he responded with a sometimes that meant always, without scandalizing his own dignity. In that, sometimes a path was born. From then on, the two began to talk about things no one usually asked: books that didn't make money, songs that reminded them of people who left, smells of places they never returned to. And the more they talked about these almost nothings, the more he discovered a wholeness in her that didn't fit in the uniform, and the more she perceived in him a tender weariness that begged for a home, not applause. The desire, which could have been urgent, chose to be patient, growing like firewood drying in the sun, absorbing the moisture of humiliation so that one day it would burn brightly without the smoke of guilt. And it was this choice, to look and hold, to feel and not take, that made the flame ignite without burning, only illuminating the truth of both. Until one night, as they closed the same window against an insistent wind, the glass returned the reflection of the two of them side by side, not as master and maid, but as two solitudes that finally met. They took a step back, knowing the outside world would exact a heavy toll on any progress. However, In the distance they maintained, a silent pact emerged, and within this pact, stronger than the house's arrogance and more stubborn than the rain, was the promise that whatever happened, dignity would be the path to certain fire. The atmosphere inside the mansion was no longer the same, and everyone who worked there sensed, albeit silently, the tension that moved from one corner to the other, like a ghost trapped within marble walls. The wife, increasingly restless, could no longer bear to feign indifference. Each restrained smile from her husband, each lingering glance that escaped against his will, were like invisible daggers in her pride. Determined to reassert her dominance, she initiated a silent confrontation, not with shouts or direct accusations, but with calculated gestures that tested everyone's limits. One morning, he asked the maid to tidy the main hall, even though he knew there would be no guests. The millionaire, passing by, found the young woman laying out tablecloths and arranging flowers as if it were a gala dinner. He asked why she was doing this, and she simply replied that it had been ordered by the lady of the house. His silence after her answer spoke volumes. His wife, watching from the stairs, smiled with satisfaction. She had managed to place her rival at the center of the scene, making him uncomfortable. But the veiled war didn't stop there. At an intimate dinner, the wife purposely asked the maid to remain in the room throughout the meal, as if she were just another decorative object. With every bite, she launched sharp questions. "Do you think my husband prefers French or Italian wine? Perhaps you know better than I do, since you're always around." The millionaire, annoyed, tried to change the subject, but the venom was already spilled onto the table. The maid endured it in silence, and precisely this silence infuriated the wife. Because her weapon didn't produce the expected pain, the millionaire began to realize the gravity of the situation. It was no longer just distrust. It was an open war, albeit one waged in the shadows. And this war demanded of him choices he had been putting off. One night, after a bitter confrontation, he entered his office and found the maid arranging books, trying to hide the anguish she carried. For the first time, he dared to say in a low voice, "Don't let yourself be shaken. You haven't done anything wrong." They were simple words, but they carried immense weight. For her, they felt like a shield, for him like a silent confession. The wife noticed the approach and decided to step up her game. She called her husband the next day and in a sweet voice suggested that perhaps it would be best to fire the maid, claiming that her presence was causing discomfort. The millionaire, however, surprised her by responding curtly, "She's staying." It was the first clearly exposed fissure. The first time he had bluntly contradicted his wife. Her gaze hardened, but the mask of elegance remained. From then on, the mansion became a divided territory. Every room was the scene of small confrontations, every social gathering concealed invisible tensions. The wife used irony, the millionaire responded with silence, and the maid endured with dignity, never overstepping the bounds of her duty. But it was precisely this resistance that made her even more present, because the more they tried to erase her, the more impossible she became to ignore. The silent confrontation had begun, and no one would emerge unscathed. The wife never had a talent for losing, and when she heard her husband's firm "she stays," she realized that elegance would no longer be her weapon of choice. The next morning, the mansion awoke to a curt order: inspection of all rooms, review of inventory, check of jewelry and documents. The reason was whispered to the staff, but loud enough to reach its target: pieces. From the safe are missing. Nothing was missing, but the rumor was the first piece of the puzzle. That afternoon, a bracelet reappeared in the maid's cleaning cart, wrapped in a scarf that wasn't hers. The butler found it, the wife expressed shock, and the millionaire, silent, realized the act by the precision of the coincidence. The perfect world of Connecticut knew this kind of theater, and the audience, made up of influential neighbors, loved whispers that could make a discreet headline. The wife didn't stop at the fake theft. He sent emails to 2 columnist friends, insinuating that the young woman engaged in inappropriate behavior, such as arriving late at her boss's office to organize papers. He planted anonymous messages on the maid's cell phone, promising financial assistance in exchange for photos she would never send. And, as a final blow, he called the girl to his room and with the calm of someone serving poisoned tea, said, "You can leave here with a letter of recommendation, or with an accusation that will make it impossible to work in any decent house on this coast. Choose." The maid's blood ran cold, but she held her breath. She said she had nothing to hide and wouldn't accept money to disappear. His wife smiled with feigned pity and replied that some truths don't need to exist to destroy a life. All it takes is the right people to believe them. That night, the millionaire found the young woman in the pantry, clutching a cloth as if holding her own wrist to keep from trembling. He didn't ask for details. He simply said that the cart story hadn't deceived him and that he would conduct an audit with his lawyer, not because he distrusted her, but to ensure that no trace of doubt remained. For the first time, the maid let a tear well up and die in the corner of her eye, not out of fear, but out of relief at being seen without having to explain herself. The blackmail, however, had more layers. His wife had shown him on the tablet a sequence of edited photos, cropped at the perfect angle to suggest intimacy where there was only respectful proximity, hands touching in passing, shadows overlapping on the glass, the reflection of the two in a window on a windy night. "Prove this isn't what it seems," she said, convinced that image always trumps truth. The millionaire responded with silence and action. He called the security company, recovered complete recordings, requested forensic analysis of the images, and ordered a new safe count. Now with the lawyer present, the maid, advised by him, wrote a simple, dated, signed and unvarnished account. The same dignity that sustained her in the hallways now supported her on paper. Outside, the whispers began to fade as forensic analysis revealed inconsistent metadata in the photos, incompatible timestamps, and a telling detail. The missing bracelet had been photographed by his wife 2 days after its supposed disappearance. The house of cards shook, but she wouldn't budge. She threatened to go public, insinuating that her husband protecting a maid would be worse than a divorce. That was when he looked into her eyes and, with a serenity that came from someone finally choosing the truth, said that no scandal frightened him more than continuing to live with the lie. The blackmail then became a mirror. Everything his wife had thrown at the maid returned to her in the form of facts, records, dates, the very weapons she had chosen to defeat. And in the midst of this siege, the young woman remained where she had always been, in the silent place of one who owed nothing. It was there, on this invisible axis, that fate aligned for what would come next. The scandal his wife had created didn't produce the expected effect. The mansion, once a scene of heavy silences, now seemed like an invisible court where every gesture was judged. The maid walked the halls with the same erect posture, the same downcast eyes, but there was a new strength in her presence. She was no longer just an employee. She was someone who had withstood the weight of lies without bending. The millionaire saw this in every detail, in the care with which she set the table, even after being accused of theft, in the delicacy with which she greeted guests despite knowing the rumors circulating about her name. It was a loyalty that couldn't be bought, asked for, or demanded. It was simply who she was. The weight of this loyalty began to fall upon the millionaire like a revelation. At social gatherings where everyone smiled in a practiced manner, he compared the empty glow of others to the firm gaze of the young woman who never needed a mask to exist. In business, where trust was a rare currency, he noticed how his own wife, surrounded by privilege, had not hesitated to lie and betray to protect her pride. And upon returning home, all he had to do was see the maid folding a sheet or arranging flowers to feel there was more truth there than in years of marriage. The wife, noticing this silent change, intensified her maneuvers. She began attending more parties and staying out with friends until late, as if to remind her husband that she still held the power of society in her hands. But what she didn't realize was that the more she was absent, the more space she left for the maid to become essential, not by taking the place of companion, but by offering a constancy that no longer existed anywhere else in that house. One night, the millionaire returned from a meeting tired, tense, weighed down by contracts threatened by speculation. He found the maid in the library turning out the lights, and upon seeing her there, the simple "good night" he received sounded more genuine than any speech of support he had heard all day. He sat down, unable to maintain his posture, and to his surprise she asked no questions, made no attempt to console him. She simply stood silently by his side, respecting the space he needed. And it was in this silence that he realized there was no pressure, no hidden agenda, not even any expectation. There was only presence, and that presence was a relief. For a man accustomed to being surrounded by intentions, that kind of loyalty was almost miraculous. Little by little, he began to wonder if the love he thought lost wasn't hidden precisely in those small gestures that never demanded anything in return. His wife might have jewelry, connections, status, but she didn't have that. The simplicity that held her together, even when everything seemed to be falling apart. However, this weight of loyalty was not light for the young woman. She knew she was at the center of a war she did not choose, and her every gesture could be misinterpreted. Still, she chose to remain true to herself. She did not allow herself to be corrupted by fear or the temptation to retaliate. She remained steadfast, as if knowing that the truth, sooner or later, prevails. This silent, seemingly fragile choice was what disturbed her wife most. Because, faced with so much pride and manipulation, the maid's loyalty became a cruel mirror, reflecting the emptiness of someone who never knew how to love without control. The millionaire, increasingly aware, began to see the difference as an inevitable sentence, and while his wife devised new strategies, he was no longer the same man. He had discovered that true wealth lay not in gilded halls, but in the silent presence of someone who, even when humiliated, chose dignity. His wife always knew how to wear masks perfectly. In gala ballrooms, her laughter echoed as if nothing could shake her. In front of the cameras, her smile was impeccable, worthy of magazine covers. Among influential friends, she exuded an almost arrogant confidence, as if she were above the uncertainties that corroded the world. But inside the mansion, where the hallways bore witness to uncomfortable silences, this mask began to crack. Her husband increasingly realized that her presence was made of appearances, rehearsed. Gestures, calculated phrases, measured emotions. She was an actress on a stage who, little by little, was losing the audience. It was on an ordinary night that the first crack became evident. The millionaire returned from a postponed meeting and found the room empty, the lights off and the bed untouched. He asked the staff, but no one knew where she was. Only the next morning, as she hurried into the kitchen, did she emerge as if she'd been out all night, justifying herself with a hasty excuse about staying late at a charity event. He didn't question her, but the lie registered in her eyes. The absences began to recur. Quick calls interrupted conversations, muffled laughter on the cell phone erupted in the hallway, secretly typed messages disappeared as quickly as they appeared on the screen. The maid, always attentive to what was happening, also noticed the signs, but kept them to herself, as if burdened by the burden of seeing what she couldn't say. Silently, she understood that the war her wife was waging against her was, in fact, a reflection of hidden guilt. The millionaire, deep down, resisted the temptation to confront her immediately. He wanted proof, not suspicions. And with each night, his wife arrived too late, wearing too much makeup, smelling of unusual perfumes. He felt the castle of appearances crumbling. The irony was cruel. While she accused the maid of being a threat, it was she herself who opened the door to a real betrayal. One afternoon, returning early from the office, he heard his wife's voice in the garden, low and whispered, unlike her usual imposture. He approached discreetly and caught only fragments, promises, knowing laughter, a tone she hadn't used even with him in the early years of their marriage. When she noticed his presence, she hurriedly hung up the phone and made up an improvised excuse. The look they exchanged at that moment needed no words. He knew something was up. She knew she'd been caught in a lapse. But as always, he pulled back the mask. He hosted a lavish dinner that night, invited influential friends, laughed louder than usual, and distributed charity as if it were virtue. The millionaire, sitting at the head of the table, watched in silence. He no longer saw the woman he had chosen years ago, but a weary figure desperate to maintain the invisible crown he believed to be his only identity. The cruelest part was that, to keep this mask intact, she continued to attack the maid. The more her own lie grew, the more she needed to project the role of threat onto the young woman. It was as if she were trying to cover up her own sin by accusing someone else. But the millionaire, alert, was no longer fooled. He knew the true betrayal lay not in the employee's discreet innocence, but in his wife's increasingly poorly rehearsed act. And silently, he began preparing for the moment when he would tear off the mask once and for all. Suspicions were no longer just shadows. They were concrete presences that infiltrated the millionaire's days like cracks in an ancient wall. He knew his wife was hiding something, and her every gesture, her sudden departure, only confirmed the intuition that no longer let him sleep peacefully. The weight of the humiliations against the maid became even more unbearable, given the hypothesis that it was all a smokescreen to conceal a greater truth. It was then that he decided not to wait any longer. He ordered a review of the mansion's external cameras, requested phone records, and began observing his wife's schedule with a rigor reminiscent of his business discipline. One Friday night, claiming an engagement in another state, his wife stepped out in a dress that seemed chosen not for a charity dinner, but for an intimate encounter. The millionaire waited patiently and instead of traveling remained silent, watching from afar. He discreetly followed her to a luxurious hotel in the neighboring city. What he saw from the sidewalk, through the reflection of the illuminated windows, left no room for doubt. His wife entered smiling, holding the arm of another man, younger, as confident as she, as if there were nothing to fear. The impact wasn't of fury, but of emptiness. Everything he'd built with her, the marriage, the social appearances, the years of living together, seemed to crumble in seconds, and the irony hit him hard. The woman who'd spent weeks accusing the maid of stealing her job was the same woman who was secretly cheating on him without the slightest shame. He returned to the mansion without immediate confrontation. He needed proof, he needed the truth laid bare so there would be no turning back. In the following days, she obtained hotel reservation records, intercepted messages on tablets left on the table, and receipts for gifts purchased with cards not intended for him. The mask had slipped, and now there was no way to pick up the pieces. Every detail was like a dart stuck deep inside: secret dinners, short trips, meetings. Scheduled on the same days, she accused the maid of intimating too much. The millionaire, faced with this avalanche of evidence, felt something shift within him. It wasn't just the pain of betrayal, it was the clarity that the war consuming the mansion was the result of a cruel projection. His wife attacked the maid not out of genuine jealousy, but because she knew somewhere deep inside that she was the first to betray him. The maid was merely a mirror reflecting the guilt she couldn't bear to face. One night, upon returning from yet another suspicious outing, the wife found her husband sitting in his office, an envelope on his desk. Inside were copies of messages, hotel records, and discreetly obtained photographs. He didn't say a word. He simply handed her the envelope and watched as she leafed through each page. The silence was heavy, harsher than any accusation. She tried to speak, to make excuses, but realized there was no room for theatrics. The mask, so well constructed over the years, was in irreparable tatters. Outside the office, the maid was passing through the hallway and noticed the tension. She didn't dare approach, but she knew something definite was happening, and, without knowing it, she carried in her heart the certainty that life's silent justice was being served, not by her hands, but by the inevitable weight of the truth that always finds its way to reveal itself. The news didn't need newspapers to spread. In Connecticut's upper crust, secrets travel. Faster than any headline, whispered over dinners, conveyed in knowing glances over champagne glasses. The millionaire's wife, who for years had built an image of herself as the perfect, elegant, and unattainable woman, began to feel the weight of social isolation. Previously inseparable friends avoided her invitations, justifying themselves with fabricated commitments. Columnists who praised her luxurious dresses began to silence. And, worst of all, the looks that had once been of admiration turned to judgment. Inside the mansion, the impact was even more cruel. The staff, always discreet, no longer regarded her with the same respect, and although no one dared to confront her directly, she sensed in their gestures the coldness of someone who wouldn't be fooled. The millionaire, for his part, didn't make a fuss. He remained silent, fulfilled his commitments, and walked away from her like someone slowly closing a door with no way back. This lack of fighting, of shouting, was what destroyed her most. She expected outbursts, threats, perhaps even forgiveness in exchange for submission, but she received only indifference, and there is no weapon more cutting than the silence of someone who no longer cares. The maid, though far from the center of decision-making, also felt the transformation. She was no longer the target of humiliation, but of looks filled with silent hatred. His wife avoided his presence, as if his mere existence were a living accusation. Every time he passed, the young woman in the hallways, the weight of his own failure crushed her, because deep down he knew that the loyalty he had tried to destroy had become proof of his own downfall. The first signs of ruin appeared in her social life. A charitable foundation removed her name from its list of patrons, citing an internal restructuring. A longtime friend was seen having dinner with another woman, quietly commenting that no one maintains respect after exposing themselves like that. Invitations became scarce, phones went silent, and the invisible crown she so proudly displayed began to crumble. Within the marriage, the distance grew with each passing day. The husband began sleeping in another room, conversations were limited to practical matters, and the maid's presence, previously invisible, became even more significant, as it was in her that he found balance amidst the chaos. The wife realized the cruel irony. The more she had tried to destroy this young woman, the more she had cemented her place, not as a lover or an intruder, but as a symbol of truth. One night, desperate, she tried to win her husband back. She dressed in her most luxurious dress, prepared a meal with candles and old-timey music, but he didn't even show up for dinner. He was in his office, working in silence while she ate alone in front of untouched plates. This emptiness was the final blow. For the first time, she felt she had lost not only her husband, but also her respect, her position, the role she believed would last forever. Karma was being fulfilled before her eyes, not in explosions, but in silent losses, one by one. She had lost her trust, lost her social admiration, lost the right to attack without question. All that remained was the broken, useless mask that no longer hid anything. The ruin was not just social, it was intimate, the weight of living surrounded by luxury, but without love, without loyalty, without truth. The choice didn't come like lightning, it came like dawn. Slow, inevitable, illuminating what had always been there. After the ruin was exposed, the millionaire spent days walking through the house in silence, feeling each object as a witness to a play he no longer wanted to perform. The maid remained at her post, firm, discreet, as if the world had not changed, and it was precisely this constancy that pushed him toward the decision he had postponed for years. He called the lawyer, asked for discretion and clarity, and organized paperwork that spoke. Not of revenge, but of closure. He wanted a clean, dignified end without spectacle. His wife received the announcement as if hearing blasphemy. She tried to bargain with memories, threatened with headlines, evoked important friends, but nothing found traction in this man who, for the first time in a long time, spoke not to win, but to free himself. There was no longer room for masks within him. The decisive night wasn't a party, it was just a simple dinner, a smaller table, soft lighting, linen, napkins that didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He waited for the house to fall silent, and when his wife came downstairs, he read a short letter in a firm voice. He didn't blame, he didn't humiliate, he simply assumed that the marriage, sustained by showmanship and pride, ended there. He said he would guarantee all her rights, that he would protect their family name from cheap scandal, but that life would no longer be a contest of appearances where both would lose. His wife laughed a mirthless laugh and replied that no one would forgive him for choosing a servant. He didn't retaliate. He simply said he wasn't choosing another woman over her. He was choosing truth over lies, and he let the words rest between them like a bridge that finally retracts. The next day he reorganized his world. He asked the security company to shut down rumors, summoned his publicist for a succinct statement about a consensual separation, and prohibited any mention of the house's employees. He went up to the library and found the maid arranging books in order of author, not color, and found that silent logic beautiful. He told her that from that day on, she would be free to decide her own path. If she wanted to stay, he would guarantee a respectful environment, free from pressure, without violent looks. If she wanted to leave, he would pay for her studies, rent, whatever was necessary, so that her life would not bear the shadow of the corridors that had humiliated her. She took a deep breath, thanked him unadorned, and asked for time. She didn't want to make decisions driven by fear or gratitude. He nodded. He demanded nothing, and in that demandlessness he confessed everything. The house reacted as places do when a secret is unraveled. It became lighter. The staff moved about without anxiety. The morning light seemed less cold. The flowers lasted longer in their vases. His wife, in her room, packed dresses as if losing territory, but kept the old imaginary crown on her face. She still believed that one final gesture could turn the tide. Unannounced, she scheduled a public appearance, a charity auction at the city's cultural center. She wanted a stage, she wanted an audience, she wanted the applause that transforms narrative into truth. The millionaire learned of the event through social media and understood that this would be the final act of the play. He would attend, not to vie for the spotlight, but to close the story before the very world that nurtured it. Before leaving, he passed through the kitchen and found the maid folding towels. She said she'd be out for a few hours, that there was no need to extend her shift, and as she turned to leave, she hesitated. He took 2 steps back, leaving an envelope addressed to her on the counter. Inside, a short letter and a study contract at a floral design school in Boston, with open dates, as if to say, the path is yours. She held the paper with both hands like someone holding a bird that can fly, and simply smiled. It was a small smile, but it was the size of a future. He left. As he closed the door, he felt no guilt, no fear, only the strange peace of someone who had finally chosen. And as the car glided down the road, the city reflected in the glass seemed to shed its skin, preparing for the night when truths would be told without shouting. Inside, in silence, the house breathed again, as if awaiting the outcome that would finally do justice to what each had sown. The night of the charity auction brought together what remained of local high society. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the ballroom, violins filled the air with calculated sophistication, and the press columns discreetly settled on the sides, eager for details that might turn into rumors. His wife entered first, draped in a shimmering gown, her smile carefully practiced, as if nothing had happened. She walked among the guests as if she still believed she owned the show, greeting with air kisses, speaking loudly, trying to keep alive the image that was already beginning to fade. But there was something different in the looks. They were no longer of admiration, but of cold curiosity, mingled with judgment. The millionaire arrived a few minutes later, sober, without the ostentation that had accompanied him in other times. He didn't have his wife or any companion with him. His silent presence was enough to attract attention. He walked between the tables with a firm, unhurried expression, as if he no longer needed to prove anything. When his eyes met hers, there was only a brief nod, lacking the complicity that had once existed. It was at that moment that many realized something was over, and there was no going back. During the event, as works of art were announced and bids were raised, his wife insisted on taking the stage and speaking. She spoke of generosity, family, and the values that sustain society. But her voice echoed hollowly, and each word seemed to contradict the secrets that were now circulating in whispers. The millionaire, seated in the back, didn't interrupt, didn't confront. He simply waited. And when it was his turn to speak, after discreetly acquiring a rare piece, he stood up and addressed the microphone. He made no accusations, didn't mention betrayals. He spoke about the truth. He said that the value of any fortune lies not in what is displayed, but in what is sustained when the masks fall. His words, simple, resonated like silent arrows. They didn't need names. Everyone knew who and what he was talking about. His wife stepped off the stage with a rigid face, still maintaining a smile, but inside she was already breaking. That same night, local newspapers published photos of her alone, trying to interact with guests who discreetly avoided her. The glow that had once accompanied her dissipated like smoke. Karma came not as a violent scandal, but as a gradual abandonment. A door that closes, a friend who no longer answers the phone, an invitation that stops coming. It was the cruelest punishment for someone who always lived to be seen. At the mansion days later, the inevitable happened. His wife left the house with suitcases dragged by servants who no longer revered her. No speech, no scene, just the cold exit of someone reaping what they sowed. The millionaire remained on the porch, watching from afar, without rancor. There was no need for revenge, because life had already done the work for him. The truth had come to light, and the weight of the lie had finally met its fate. The maid, in turn, received from the millionaire himself an opportunity she had never dreamed of. With the letter and the study contract in hand, she felt her path open before her. There were no impulsive declarations of love, no empty promises. There was respect, there was recognition, there was freedom. She would soon leave for Boston to study what she loved, taking with her the memory of a silent struggle won not by force, but by dignity. Before leaving, he crossed the mansion once more. He touched the wood of the large table, where he had been humiliated so many times with his fingertips, walked through the corridors that had witnessed his silence, and for a moment closed his eyes. There was no resentment, only the certainty that every held-back tear had been transformed into strength, every humiliation into a test of character. He smiled slightly, and as he walked out the front door, he knew the weight of history would be left behind, while the future opened before him like a horizon after a storm. The millionaire, alone on the balcony, watched her leave. He didn't chase after her, didn't ask her to stay. He knew the greatest proof of love he could offer was to leave her free, intact, preserved from the shadow that had nearly destroyed her. He simply remained silent, feeling that somehow life had given him a second chance, not to start over with her immediately, but to learn to be worthy of true love when fate allowed. And so, the cycle closed. The wife who fought so hard to maintain an invisible crown lost everything due to her own arrogance. The maid, who silently endured the greatest pain, emerged stronger, paving the way for a new life. The millionaire, caught between two worlds, chose the truth. Karma fulfilled its role. Each received exactly what they built, without exaggeration, without forced justice, simply with the silent weight of life that returns everything in kind. If this story touched you in any way, leave a like, subscribe to the channel and continue following our next stories full of emotion and twists.